All right, everybody. This Dojo Talks was a suggestion of mine. And 1972 was, of course, the year that Fischer Spassky happened. Really a breakthrough year for chess all over the world, but especially in the, let's call it the Western world, the United States and Western Europe. Vastly popularizing the game. And the other thing is, of course, I'm going to be 50 years I'm going to be 50 years old this year. So it's a moment to kind of reflect. And I'm just sometimes stunned when I think back on all the ways that chess has changed in my lifetime. And so I wanted to just use this opportunity to reflect on some of those changes, how the game has changed. And I thought it'd be interesting to bounce some of my thoughts, observations off of these two guys who belong to different generations. David's about 10 years younger than me, and then Kostya's about, 20 years younger than me. So we've kind of got difference in generations where Kostya basically has been grew up with the computer being there all the time, whereas I did not. The computer came really later. So I wanted to reflect on some of those changes. Okay, so I'll tell you what, I'm gonna just name some of the big changes and we can talk about them however you please, all right? Now, the first change, and I think the biggest one in my lifetime has been the demographic change, both in terms of who are the top players and who plays in general. So for example, when I was a kid, India wasn't playing chess. China wasn't playing chess. There was really, it was a Western game, you know? And so you went to tournaments and it was all, first of all, in the United States, there were like some Asian kids, but it wasn't that big of a thing. And the top kids in the States and really all over the world were these Russian Jewish kids. I remember I would go to the top tournaments when I was a kid. It was always these Russian Jewish kids that either their parents had immigrated or they had themselves come over quite recently from some Eastern Bloc country, usually the Soviet Union. And so when you think about it, just in terms of, if you just imagine a map of the world, there was just a few countries where a significant amount of people were playing. We're talking about the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc. And then we've got some Western European countries where a lot of tournaments were being held because there was some money there, a little bit of tradition, say in the Netherlands, Germany, England, but not that many tournaments. And then a little bit in the United States with the Fischer boom. And before the Fischer boom, you know, we weren't terrible before the Fischer boom. We had some other players, but it wasn't that significant. But even after the Fischer boom, it's got to be said, the level of play, the amount of tournaments you could play in was not that high. And our top players were going over to Europe to play. Now things have shifted dramatically, where if you just think about a map of the world, like so many countries have strong chess teams now. Imagine Vietnam. Vietnam's got an amazing chess tradition now. It's happened very recently. A lot of small countries you'd never even thought of with chess. And there's only a couple pockets of the developed world where there's no chess. Like, for example, I think Japan is one of the few countries which still has basically no chess development. Okay, I'm ranting a little bit, but it's amazing to me to just go back and reflect on it. Obviously, the computer, we'll talk a little bit about that, about how that's changed and how that's changed how we think about the game, for sure. There's a lot to be said about that. And we got to, I guess, the other thing on my mind, and I'm interested in what you guys think of as the most prominent shifts as well. But the other thing on my mind is how social media, especially in the last 10 years, has actually changed the game. I do think it's really changed the way people think and approach the game. Anyways, I'm going to stop there. I'm talking too much. I'll turn over to you, and then we can talk about whatever you guys want to talk about.
Yeah, great. No, maybe David, maybe you want to go next and give your, I don't know.
I think I'd like to pick up on what Jesse said about the demographic thing for a second, because, you know, around the time or shortly before Fischer won the match against Spassky, there was a USSR versus rest of the world match, and the USSR won it, right? So if you want a sense of like the level of the rest of the world how much chess there was out there, right? Like a single very large country could defeat all the other countries of the world. And honestly, the rest of the world outperformed expectations in that match, right? They were expected to just like be absolutely slaughtered. Honestly, it's like it was hard to conceive of that being competitive enough to even be a good match.
But to be fair, USSR was like Russia, Armenia, Ukraine.
Yeah, so that's why I said like one big country.
but it wasn't Hungary, it wasn't Poland. Well, there's all these other Eastern Bloc countries that were not part of the USSR team.
Yeah. You know, and I think there was like a pretty long period in chess history where even if the USSR didn't use players who weren't from Russia, I mean, they could have basically played a pretty fair match against the rest of the world. Right. So like you could take away Mikhail Tal or something, but they had enough of the top, 20, 30 grandmasters in the world that they could still play a good match against the rest of the world at any point. And then when Jesse mentions like chess in different places and like how India now has like a large percentage of the top juniors, right, at all these world youth under 12, under 13, under 14, they're like cleaning up medals. Well, India didn't get their first grandmaster until Anand in 1988, by which time I was already born. India was like absolutely nothing like Jesse was saying. But then like you've got even like countries that are much newer than India as far as being chess powers. You've got like Uzbekistan, which is still maybe like 2 years away from being like an international chess power. But like you can already tell when you look at like the junior tournaments over the last couple of years, or like Iran, Iran and Uzbekistan, two very much like just, where did that come from to suddenly become top chess countries? So I think that's I think that's one of the biggest trends really is like how chess has moved around the world and sort of changed where it's played. And what that makes me wonder about, when there was Fischer versus the Soviets, it was like this very clear clash between like an individual genius like coming out of like nowhere, right? Like if you compare Fischer's level with like the chess community he came out of, he scored like 11-0 in a US championship, right? So it was like, it wasn't like he got better thanks to the competition that other American players provided him or like study buddies or anything like that. Right. He like had this narrative, like he just like was all on his own, did it. Right. And the Soviet Union, where there's like strong chess culture, clubs, competition, seconds at tournaments, like teams preparing before events and stuff like that. And I wonder with the new world that we have now, whether you guys feel like we've got a bunch of like random geniuses in different places, or whether we still have like groups and pockets of culture that are actually like building them up, right? Like when you see 14 geniuses in the same country, like Uzbekistan or Iran, is there like a chess culture and a program that's bringing them up, or they just happen to be a few geniuses in the same place at the same time?
I think it's definitely the culture, especially in a place like India, where they have like all these great coaches. And yeah, of course, Anand like inspired like just a huge generation of players there. But I think over the last couple of years, I mean, they've done all these like training sessions. Their players are sponsored. They get paid to go play in tournaments and travel. So I think it's really just that like entire culture that's done so well for India. I'm not sure how it works in China, but I would imagine some similar thing where it's like all the players are getting supported and they're like spending a lot of money on coaching and training, and really it's like the whole country is involved.
I mean, briefly, they do all move to like one building in Beijing once they're identified as being talents, and they all live in that same building and train.
Oh, well, yeah. That definitely feels like a culture thing.
Very centralized in that sense. Like it would be like every single, like, oh, you're good at chess, you have to live in this building.
Though I do think it's got to be said, I think it's an obvious point, is that the computer and the internet have reduced the importance of those chess centers. For example, like when I was a kid, I was growing up in New Mexico. You could play. There was like a couple masters in the whole state, and I'd have to like get somebody to drive me to go play these guys. And that was the case really throughout the United States. And there was just a couple centers. And for the most part, for the longest time, it was New York City. So we can talk about Fischer being on his own, but actually he had loads of strong players in New York City to fight against coming up. And that was the center for the most part forever. And now the computer has vastly reduced the importance of distance. And we see it especially now in the last couple of years where the people are just hiding out in their houses. It's hard to talk about culture when people are hiding out in their houses, but they're hanging out with each other. And if you look at the Indian chess scene, right, like Shagar Shah in that whole Chess Base India and other like streamers, they've got a whole scene going, but it's online, it's online. So it's it's reduced the geographical importance. And with that, I think it's interesting, important to say that I feel as every year goes by less committed to like a national identity. I'm still into it. I'm still in the idea of like maybe a U.S. world champion or a U.S. team winning the Olympiad. But I think what's interesting in the last controversy with Dubov and the Russian team was they're still really into it. They're still into like the national identity and proving yourself as a nation or something like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas I look at a kid like Ali Reza, that kid's a citizen of the world. Would it be cool for Iran if he won? I guess. But he's really just out there. Does he belong to France? No. Does he belong to Iran? Not really. So I think in a lot of ways, he's like one of these examples of this computer generation. He's definitely played more games online than he's played over the board, So anyways, I'm just saying, I think it's still important, but drastically reduced from what it used to be.
Yeah, no, it definitely feels like for me, the biggest change since the 72, I mean, it has to be like computers and engines and just how much easier it's gotten to study the game. I think that's definitely a big part of why we see now so many players from all over the world. It's because they have the same access to all the books and databases that the USSR used to have like a huge advantage on. Just having like games to the tournaments and analysis and being able to read in Russian, used to be an edge. Now, of course, I think that's all pretty much gone. And that was the biggest change for me. Like, because when I started playing tournaments, chess on the computer wasn't yet a thing, but I remember when I was pretty young, like maybe 8 or 9, I saw my first ad for like ICC, and it was like play chess online. I think maybe it was like around 2000 or so. I'm really not sure. And then when I saw that, I got like very excited, but I actually didn't end up playing until like a couple years later. So I think I was a few years late to ICC. I think I was probably like 13 or 14 when I actually started playing on there. And it was just like the wild, wild west. It's just like you could play as many games as you want. You can play in tournaments. You could do like you can solve puzzles with the puzzle bot. I mean, it was totally revolutionary because chess used to be just like an exclusively paper thing. You solve puzzles on worksheets and you play it on a plastic board. And now it's like, the computer, I think it just changed everything.
Here's another thing that changed everything. It's economic opportunities within chess, because having access to like training and stuff, that can get you started, right? But I think a lot of people in the West used to quit once they got into chess. Right. They would reach a certain age and, their themselves or their families or their friends or just their social milieu would say like, okay, it's really cool that you're into that Russian game, but like, what are you going to do? Like earn like £5 an hour for like teaching lessons, or get like a real job and earn 10 times that much, and chess it didn't have economic opportunities. So number one, to have chess all over the world, number one, you need people to have access to it, which the computers provided right? But then number two, you need there to be like a path for them to keep playing instead of like quitting, as they go from childhood to adulthood.
Yeah. Yeah. I want us to stress, like, when I was a kid, if chess was shrugged off by all of the adults in my life, whether it was my family, teachers, and I was just interested in chess, and no, they were just like, that's just some dumb game. It wasn't even a Russian game. They didn't even know it was a Russian game. So it was like, there was no support or belief that it could be something outside of just some dumb thing, Right. And that was a big psychological problem for me as a kid. And even it took me a long time to get over that. For example, I had a choice really when I was like 18 to either go to college, where I had the opportunity because of a chess scholarship to go to college, or to just play chess. And because of that societal expectation, that's definitely a key reason why I did college and then went on the whole academic adventure that I did. Yeah. So I think it's amazing to think back on all the changes that have happened at chess, and each of them affects my person and how I view myself. For example, here's another one that's really interesting. Back in the day, without the computer, what the computer does is it allows everybody, whether they're rated 900 or what, to look at a grandmaster's game and to kind of call him an idiot because you can see exactly where they screwed up. And the computer can even explain to you, in a sense, what you missed or what they missed. And I want to really stress that back in the day, there was a cult of the master and the grandmaster. And it's hard to even imagine, but imagine yourself at one of these tournaments and you're a kid and somebody walks in and there's like hush comes over the room and it's like, oh, he's a master. Just the idea of like USCF 2200 was like a big deal. It's like, oh, he's a master. And there was like a mystique. And a lot of the mystique was the fact that you couldn't understand
what he's thinking.
Even that it was possible for the guy to make a mistake. Right? It was like the guy had access to some hidden thing that was inscrutable. You didn't even know what it was. It was like a magical power that sometimes you get it with like a similar thing with, we get certain cults of authors. Like there's a certain like, oh, I don't know how he ever wrote that thing or how she wrote that thing. And just this power, this mystical power emanating from the idea of the author. You had that mystique around in the chess world with masters and grandmasters. And what it led to was a kind of hierarchy that is still there a little bit, but is not there as much, where there was like a sense of authority that the higher rated player had over the lower rated player. And it wasn't like somebody's rubbing in your face or something, but you definitely felt it. And that's just that's still there in a very minor way, but I'm telling you that it was thick in the atmosphere back in the day. I don't know how you felt about that, David, but say, for example, when David grew up in the Bay Area and I had family there, so I'd go visit there, and there were some guys like Whitehead or Grief, and they'd be around the streets and they'd be like, oh man, those guys, man, you want to mess with them? It was like this real power of mystique around.
I remember that trying to win my first game against a national master was like a really big deal. Several times that like I had like chances in the game against them and failed. And it's like, wow, like even when you're doing well, like it's just a different like level, Yeah. And also seeing guys like Grief and Walter Brown at the coffee shops in Berkeley.
Right.
And right. Like you like, whoa. they're real people in like a normal place, like, but they're not real people. Was crazy.
I think that hierarchy thing is still there, like in live in person in tournaments. Like if there's a group of players and like the highest rated player in the group is talking, everyone just shuts up and just listens to them. So if it's like an IM in a group of masters or like a GM in a group of IMs or whatever, if the highest rated player is talking, like everyone is just like listening to them. It's only online that you get people that are like, actually Engine says this move is 0.7 and this move is 0.5. So isn't this move better? Like you don't get that in person, which I really like about the chess scene. I like that kind of authority thing. Actually, another really interesting thing is, just yesterday we were, or I was reading a book, going through a game from Tal's Life and Games, one of his World Championship games against Botvinnik, and he was writing about how, like, in the analysis after the match, one of Botvinnik's seconds posted all this stuff about how Tal's like combination wasn't quite sound, and it was just like months of like analysis, and then like one of Tal's seconds had to like refute that guy's analysis, and it just like went back and forth. That's the part it's kind of a shame I missed out on, because I was always, when I was growing up, I was too young to like analyze a position on my own. Like I would just have no idea what I was doing, and by the time I was old enough, to kind of appreciate, then computers had already taken over, and it was all about just analyzing with the engine. When I was younger and we would like maybe analyze a position with a coach or something, then it was just like, whatever the coach says is correct. We didn't even question it. It's just like whatever he says about a position, like that's what it is. And if you didn't know something, it didn't bother me back then. Like if I played some game and I lost, and then I had like no idea why I lost, I was just like, weird. Like I guess they just outplayed me. Whereas like now it's like that would never that would never hold. I would have to check the game like with the engine. Oh, where did I go wrong? What was the mistake? Whereas back then it's like there were mysteries in the chess world, and that was fine. It wasn't a problem, which is kind of interesting. Last thing I wanted to say is that my grandma still tells me to go get a real job, even though she, you think she would be kind of more okay with the Russian game thing. No, she still has this vision in her mind that, chess players are starving artists and should instead use their skills making money for the bank.
Yeah. I mean, it's changed really, really rapidly. I mean, I think in my own life, my parents went from being like, when is he going to get over this? Right. Like, it's kind of like he's a degenerate to like, we're really proud of what you've contributed, my own parents, just evolving with the times and with me. And, it's interesting to think that exactly what we're doing here with the dojo, if chess were like a little bit less popular or had like a little bit less money in it, maybe everyone would be like, they're degenerates, right? And then if there's just a few more people who are into it, and then other people see that other people are into it, they're like, oh, it's really impressive what they're doing, or something like that. I know, Jesse, you're not into like, the social validation of what you do and stuff like that, but you're also very sensitive to noticing when it's out there and when that's a piece of it. And I think it's like huge with chess. You can see the exact same activity and just like, is there or isn't there money in it? And then that's whether or not people validate what you're up to.
Yeah. And honestly, it's not just money. It's also, there's this very interesting thing that's happened in the last especially last 5 years, I feel, where there's a lot of social validation amongst chess players, regardless of rating, of their quest. And I can see it especially like on Twitter with the chess punks thing. It's like, it's not simply some monetary thing. It's like, oh yeah, there's people out there who share the bubble that I'm in. And one of the things I want to really stress about chess compared to now to back in the day is, back in the day, you were alone, my friend. You were all alone. There, you would be studying by yourself with some books, and there was very few people to talk to, no one to validate you. And that was it. That was it. There was not this thing where you had, especially now with, let's call it, accessibility to masters in the way they thought, or like, had out, or not just about chess, but about anything, what their daily lives looked like. You had no idea. You were just all alone by yourself. And that kind of, there was kind of like the players who got good, right, were these people who were good at sitting by themselves and not needing some incredible social validation, right? Whereas now it's very interesting. You get validation immediately. Even if you won a game as a 1500 or whatever, and you post it on Twitter, people are like, right on, dude, great. And I guess that's cool. Yeah, that's great, man. You're able to be part of something much quicker than back in the day. Yeah, it's a huge difference, massive. Yeah, I love this topic because it's stunning to me how much, when I think back on it, the difference is just a completely different game. One thing I want to say about the hierarchy and the mystique around players too, is that when I think about, when you ask yourself, well, how has the game itself and the way it's played changed? And I think the anecdote which clears it up for me the most is when I was doing commentary on the U.S. senior before COVID happened, and the juniors running alongside of it, and so we're just doing commentary, and I had a Wonder Liang in there. He's a prominent young kid, now a GM, very strong kid, and I asked him to just comment off the cuff about one of the games from the older section, and it was very strong older GMs playing the U.S. senior, which I now aspire to play myself, and he's like, oh yeah, this is like chess from the 90s. I was like, chess from the 90s? What are you talking about? And what he meant was, back in the day, before the computer, you had plans and you had like a conceptual vision about how the game would develop. And a lot of times your opponent would cooperate with that vision because they also thought, okay, this is where the game is going. And so both players, kind of like conspiracy, would be following the edges of this plan down this road. Whereas now, with the computer, it's become much more move for move by move chess, right? So like, instead of thinking in these grand conceptual terms, it's more like, okay, step for step, here we're going along, and tactics the whole way. No longer like this strategic conception of the game. Vastly different. And one of the things about it that I want to stress is, when you think about the old cult of the Grandmaster, part of the thing was like the idea that this guy had a vision of the way the board and the pieces worked. And that's the idea of that vision is completely compromised if you start thinking of chess as a move by move game, right? There's no, because there's still like strategic ideas and of course all that stuff. It's not like it's out the window. But once you think of it as a move by move game, where when you look at it with the computer and it starts bouncing all over the place, showing you all kinds of ideas that you had no idea that they were there, you start realizing, oh, the whole mystique has been crushed, man. And it's this entirely different game where now kids can be competitive who have no strategic conception, who have just like gotten their tactics reasonable and their openings reasonable, and all of a sudden they're at least dangerous. They're not going to become world champion or anything until they get some strategic understanding, but they can become dangerous, which back in the day they were not. They were not dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like chess knowledge is evolving. Like, people are getting like stronger and more knowledgeable for their level. And I definitely felt that, I feel like, in tournaments, not just in terms of opening knowledge or like in-game knowledge, but I think people nowadays, like one specific thing I've noticed, like especially for like lower rated players, are much more willing to sacrifice material than they used to be. And I think that's because the engine has shown all these opportunities, and there are all these lessons, from tournaments, and people are following high-level events. And I think like almost every round in the commentary, it'll be a theme. Like, oh, here you should sack a pawn for the initiative. Here you should sack a pawn to avoid getting a really bad, terrible passive position. And so this is one thing where people have just like picked up on and are now much less fearful of giving away stuff.
And they have much less fear of authority. So, for example, back in the day, we're talking just 10, 15 years ago, if I was playing a lower rated player, so many of the games that I would have would be them being in a crouch position all game long, just in a crouch. Don't hurt me, Cry. Don't hurt me. I'm just hiding. And now they're biting back.
Yeah.
They're biting back.
Yeah. I mean, remember that like Petrosian and then later Topalov were like famous for like an exchange sack, right? Mm-hmm.
Right.
For like sacrificing exchanges, as if that weren't just something that everybody does. Like, oh, this one person in the world sacrifices exchanges. When you've got two pawns with an outpost and there's only one file, and you put your rook in the outpost square because if they take it with a knight or a bishop, you recapture with like a protected pass pawn and like a good structure.
Yeah. Like
basically one of the most obvious kinds of exchange stack possible, right? Mm-hmm. That was like a revelation. Like, whoa, Now Now I think like your average like 1500, if they're looking at a fight on like a single open file and they know that the person who plays rook c5 or rook c4 first, like it's just, you just put your piece there.
Yeah. It's much more prevalent these days. It feels like at the time Petrosian and Topalov, they were kind of like revolutionary, but yeah, it shows how much things have changed since then.
Here's another thing that's interesting about it, is that you could talk about the speed of chess knowledge dispersing. And so let me give you an example. 1972, or excuse me, I guess it was 1971, Fischer and Taimanov in the match, and games 2 and 4 in particular introduced the idea, which we covered game 4, I believe, on our Endgame Sensei, with the so-called Fischer endgame, rook and bishop versus rook and knight. And Fischer not only showed that with like an incredible clarity of like, oh my God, this is now a thing, but also that the bishop was a stronger piece. Now, back in the day, this was not how people thought. They thought, okay, knights are better in some situations, bishops are better in others, essentially equal pieces. And one of the things that's interesting, what I mean by information dispersal, is that the top GMs in the world might have seen those games, but they did not accept that. They did not accept that as some kind of truth. And a hilarious book to read in this regard is Sarawan's, his Chess Duels, it's called, is a book where he talks about the games he played against the world champions. A good book, and what you see in it is Sarawan in the 80s didn't understand that the bishop was a stronger piece. He didn't get it at all. And by Sensei Smyslov, he didn't get it at all either. He still kept playing the same way. And what I want to stress is now, one of the things that's so interesting is everyone has turned on the computer, and the computer is like, bishop? Oh yeah, that's better. It loves the bishop, man. It freaking loves the bishop. Space? Oh yeah, let's take it. Space is amazing. And so people turn on their computers, and then they use the authority of that to change their way of thinking about the game, which happens so much quicker than it did in the past, where it took decades for people to really appreciate the Fischer revolution with both Fischer ending and then the bishop. Right. Just as one example.
Yeah. People still don't fully approve of the bishop pair, the advantage of the bishop pair. There's a growing community out there that believes that the bishop pair is something that can only be exploited by really strong players. And so for club players, it's not worth trying to get the bishop pair. It doesn't matter. Which I think is kind of a funny point.
I have some sympathy for that point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's in a similar way. You have lower rated players wanting the queen over the 2 rooks because it's too hard to coordinate the 2 rooks. Kind of a similar phenomenon. And it's true, you need a certain level of skill before that becomes applicable. And so, for example, one of my favorite rants is when people play the queen c2 Nimzo, where you're giving up time in order to get a bishop. You better have a deep understanding of how that bishop works, my friend.
Yesterday, Jesse, I was commenting a game where somebody had played bishop d2 and a3 against the Nimzo to get the bishop pair, right, and recapture without the doubled pawns. And their opponent played c takes d4, bishop takes d4. So glorious dark squared bishop. And they're just developing their pieces. And then black plays knight c6. And white left the bishop on d4. They didn't drop it back to c3. There was nothing else going on. No tactics, no rush. Development was complete, right? And they just left the piece there. And that's like, leaving a rook somewhere where your opponent's bishop is attacking it, right? It's like they just attack you with the less valuable piece and you don't retreat it. But as you said, not only that, but they played all these opening moves, the point of which was to have that bishop, right? So,
right.
So not knowing sometimes not knowing the reasons behind what you're doing, still there.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, with with all the new technology, there are definitely like new challenges. And nowadays, I think one of them is that, and I don't think that was the case in the game, because I saw that game you were talking about, David. I don't think that was the case yesterday, but necessarily. But yeah, people are definitely putting a huge focus on like trying to remember their opening moves and not so much like understanding the deeper ideas, which I think back in the day it was probably like all about like the ideas, right? Like what you're playing for, and now with like all these databases and like Chessable and ChessBase, there's all this access to all this theory, but yeah, it's actually not clear if it's a great use of time for players to be studying that theory. I think we mostly think that it's not a good use of time. And actually, I see people all the time on in our Discord and on Reddit asking a question like, I'm 700. How many moves should I be memorizing? Is like MCO a good book, or is like FCO a good book? Like those like old those old books. I forgot what they're called, but with like the David knows.
We used them. Jesse and I did. We had like MCO for openings. We had the MCO, informant to see the latest novelties.
Yeah, it's just like, oh yeah, how many moves should I be like memorizing here? It's like 0. You shouldn't be trying to do that at all. Which I think is one of the problems of like the new age, in that there's so many resources out there, and a lot of them are just marketed, right? They're not actually useful for chess players, but they're kind of like marketed, like, oh, this is what you should be doing. And of course, people that are not experienced in the chess world, they have no idea how to differentiate between good advice and bad advice. And so we get this kind of issue.
I've got another huge change.
Okay.
Time controls, just the time spent on chess. And from some perspectives, as far as like your experience of playing chess or my experience of playing chess, you might almost say this has like an effect that's comparable to the computer engines changing things, right? Like computer engines changing our tools and our ideas and our access to stuff. But then, I mean, when you're actually playing the game, how much time do you spend playing like 5-minute games versus 10-minute games? The lack of adjournments. We're not playing, 10-game correspondence matches against each other by postcard. Like, I don't know, just the amount of time that we spend on the game, what's left on our clock when we get to the end game. This kind of stuff might be changing your experience of playing chess almost as much as the new knowledge and information.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say for me, when ICC back in like 1990 something, when I got to go on there and play very strong players, it was like a huge access point. Because previously the amount of times I had played titled players wasn't that much. So all of a sudden I had access to all these players playing Blitz. Amazing. So that was already one thing. It allows access, I think, Blitz does, online Blitz, to the game, in which previously, traveling to tournaments. So costs a lot, takes time, all that other stuff. The other thing I think is important to think about chess at the high level is Anand made a great quote when he was doing some commentary recently, that when you try to compare Magnus with, say, Kasparov, where it's unfair and kind of unreasonable, is back in the day, for Kasparov, it was just classical chess, whereas for Magnus, it's also blitz and rapid. Also for his ego, you can tell it too. Like he wants to win all those things, and for me, it's even weird when he's taking blitz and rapid so seriously, but he does. And I think the younger generation also feels that too. They even want to win at the bullet, So it's like being good at chess is being good now across a spectrum of time controls for the top player.
Well, I think it's a very natural thing to evolve, because it's like if you imagine a world where like all the games in classical chess are drawn and all the players are just drawing each other, then the only way to differentiate, or one of the main ways to differentiate, is by kind of reducing the time control, Fischer 960. But like one of the main ways would be just to reduce the time control until there's a bigger disparity in the strength of the players.
So kind of to compensate for people getting stronger, you take away their time and see how strong they are with less time.
And due to like kind of the drawish nature of the game, like a lot of end games that are better are like mathematically drawn, and people have gotten a lot better at holding those end games too.
And it's true. We do a thing where we tell people like, learn how to checkmate with bishop and knight, let's say. And then we'll be like, okay, if you can do it with like 5 minutes, can you do it with 2 minutes? Right. Or something I'll sometimes do when I do like endgame sensei type training. Before I had Jesse, the way I would do it is I would like play an endgame like that and this was before 30-second increment. So I would sit down with my training partner. We would play an endgame with like, let's say 15 minutes on the clock. And then if we thought we were starting to get better at it, we would take the time down to 10 minutes and see if we could still like execute the end game that we'd been learning. And then we'd take it down to 5. And if we could play it well with 5 minutes, then we're like, okay, we understand this end game, and we'd move on. So maybe like a similar thing with overall chess skill getting better, taking down the time.
Yeah. So it seems like general time controls have gotten faster over the years. I've been watching this very interesting documentary with Kasparov on the Levitov chess channel, where they're just interviewing Kasparov about all his earlier games and achievements.
Interesting.
It is great. It's got English subtitles. It's in Russian, but the subtitles are quite good. And he made the point that the shortening of time controls actually corresponds with like his helm as being world champion. Like that's when they got rid of adjournments, and that's when things really started to speed up, which I thought was interesting. And
maybe they transitioned from 40 and 2.5 to 40 and 2.
Yeah, I think he mentioned that's when they I think during one of like the Kasparov Karpov matches, they wanted to cut it by half an hour, and then they were both like, "What are you talking about? This is a disgrace." Yeah.
Can't tell you guys how long chess games used to be. It used to be really long. Imagine 40 moves, 2.5, and then you got another hour for the next 20 moves, then another hour for the next hour, another 20 moves after that. It was incredible. It was incredibly long. Yeah, I kind of miss it, but I also realize like, how did they do it? It was incredible. Another shift, which has got to be mentioned, and I think it's really accelerated in the last couple of years, is that the game has become much younger. We've talked a little bit on the podcast about aging. I like that. I liked when we talked about that. It was an interesting discussion we had. And that is kind of going hand in hand with the chess players just in general getting younger. So as an anecdote, I played 2 weeks ago or so in this Baltimore Open, and my first round opponent was, 9 years old. And I won, but it wasn't an easy struggle. The next guy was like 15. Then I played the one old-time GM that was there, and we drew. And then I played another very tough FM who was like 16 years old, and my final round opponent was like 17. So it was like this thing where it affects the game socially as well as and indeed also, of course, of how the game's played. And I just want to say, for me, one of the things I understood in that new environment was back in the day when I would go from tournament to tournament, I would know everybody at those tournaments because I had been playing them for years. And so imagine you're sitting on like the first row of boards or whatever, boards 1 through 10, and I would be able to look down that line of people, and I would know all of those people. Maybe not well, not necessarily friends or anything, but I'd be like, oh, I know where that person's from. I know roughly this and that about their game. Now I look down there, I don't know anybody. And then, that tournament too, was like, I was hanging out at lunch between rounds. And back in the day, I would know somebody. We'd have lunch. And there were people who came up to me because they knew about the dojo. And they're like, oh, yeah, Cry, nice to meet you, blah, blah, blah. But I didn't have any, it wasn't like we went back decades or something like that. And all the old timers, at least for the last couple tournaments, since back after COVID, they're all kind of gone. And I think maybe that trend had been imperceptibly happening. I say imperceptibly, at least to me, the trend of it getting younger before COVID, but now it's just super evident. It's super evident how young the game has become.
Yeah. I think when we were younger, Jesse, if there had been like a 9 or 10-year-old in the open section, it would have been one of them, and it would have been like a big deal. Like everybody would be like, oh my God, there's like a kid in the open.
Yeah, you probably already know their name ahead of time.
Yeah, it didn't happen. It didn't really happen. Right. Yeah. I think another thing that that's happening and also just bears mentioning is, chess has always been very, more dudes than women, strongly more dudes. And I would say that the interesting thing there is that circa 1990, when the Polgars came on the scene, there was the biggest sense of, let's say, hopefulness or whatever, that women were going to break into the game and it was going to be this whole brand new deal. And that, I think, to most people's surprise, it didn't happen, because it really felt like there was, we can argue about why it didn't or yada yada, but there was this real sense that it was going to happen around 1990, and then it didn't. And now, one of the things that's still remarkable to me, and just also my last couple tournaments, because post-COVID, because I was like, okay, well, are we going to see a bunch more women out there? We've definitely seen a lot more younger people. And I would say proportionally, it's still very minor, which is, and one thing about it's got to be said is when you go online and you look at Twitter, there's a lot of and on Twitch too, there's a very large group of women who are doing very successful streams and, Twitter feeds and all this stuff. But in the tournament level, I'm not seeing it yet. So I think one of the interesting things about me thinking about the last 50 years is it's changed, but so far not so much, and ultimately, if chess is really going to break through, I've always felt since 1990 that is what we needed. And yeah, the hopefulness was not just like, women are going to come into their own, but like chess would become more mainstream by women coming into the game, which I think is definitely true. And I think, especially when you see the social media stuff and you see how successful the women streamers are, that's like, oh, right. Yeah. Chess needs them. Chess needs them in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think, one thing we haven't really talked about, but things are getting a lot more online. And the way it's going, it feels like we're headed towards a future where online tournaments will be just as important as OTB tournaments. At least that's how I think things are shifting.
I don't know about that.
Not quite.
I don't know about that.
Certainly quite important. You'll have top players in the world playing in them.
Yeah.
I know it's hard for you guys to hear. I understand you don't like the changing aspects.
It's not about whether or not I like it. I still think there's some little, some untouchable things about being in person when you play chess. So I don't think it'll ever quite equalize. But it could go from 99% importance to OTB to 60-40 or 65-35 or something. I can't see it 50-50 myself.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely not. I don't think it's 99 right now. I think we've already come down a bit.
Yeah. I agree for sure.
I do prefer OTB, but yeah, that's just where it feels like I'm imagining 50 years into the future, and it's just it's very fast and it's very online. That's what I'm feeling. It's just the trajectory that seem to be taking. But no, there will always be room for people who just want to sit down with a normal wooden chessboard. I'll definitely die on that hill with you guys. I think there'll always be room for that.
Yeah, I'm not asking anyone to die on any hill. I'm not trying to object to your comment, and I don't have any skin in the game whether other people prefer playing online or if Magnus and Wesley and the top players of the next generation decide online tournaments are the best thing for them. That's fine with me. I don't care. I would just be a little bit surprised because I think there is something to playing in person. But
I could totally see that 2027. Farouj is I won't play the next World Championship unless it's online.
Right.
And I was like, oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Well, do you guys have any last thoughts on this topic before we wrap up?
I think we talked so much about the changes, and just at the end, Jesse touched on, female participation and how that has been something that has lagged. I think it's maybe interesting to say what hasn't changed really briefly in 50 years, 3 things which to me have lagged. Like Jesse, female participation has not advanced the way I would like it to or would have hoped it would. I'm not going to say what other people hope or expect, but for myself, it's underperformed. Another thing is like Bobby Fischer, he was already saying like, classical chess is like dead. It's played out. There's like agreed opening draws, blah, blah, blah. He came up with chess 960, Fischer random chess, right? That's like an idea from Bobby. It's 50 years later. I think it's like 20 years overdue by now. And I'm also disappointed in how little that's changed, and I don't, we're not going to say why, but that's something which I would have expected could have changed more in the last 20 years and hasn't yet. And I wonder if it will. And then the third thing that hasn't really changed much is like chess politicians. And again, you wonder if and when that might ever change. But the way chess players kind of get, the way FIDE and national federations operate and how all that stuff works out is, still pretty comparable in some ways to 50 years ago. So that's something else that hasn't progressed dramatically, in my view.
Yeah. That makes sense. For me, I feel like endgame technique. People are still like really struggling with endgame technique and like simple endgames. I feel like the knowledge hasn't really evolved there, but that's something I'm going to try to correct in the future.
Yeah. I guess one thing I just end with then is that hasn't changed that I guess I wish it would is chess has definitely become more popular. We've had, as we should just know, this show is about really two booms, the Fischer boom, and then recently we would call it the Queen's Gambit boom, but also it was an internet boom, COVID boom, is that when I look at tournaments, specifically in the US, but I don't think it's changed much in Europe either, let's say open tournaments, the conditions of the players there has not improved dramatically. We're still playing in kind of close quarters. There's like often a board right next to you. The prize fund isn't great. The lighting is often terrible. There's a lot that could be better about it. And so I think although chess has progressed a lot in terms of popularity and a variety of ways, the tournaments themselves still look in terms of the conditions, the demographics have shifted for sure, but the conditions themselves, I really wish had changed. And they're not that much different than they were, let's say, 30 years ago. Yeah.
All right.
Right.
All right. That was fun, you guys.
Very cool. Yeah. That will wrap it up for the show. Thanks everyone for listening.
We'll see you next week.